Welcome to another chapter of the Crown podcast. Today, we are so blessed to have our next guest. She is a licensed psychologist, a speaker, a consultant. She specializes in the mind body connection. She's about well being, she's about helping people to make healthy choices. She has a very, very unique style. If you follow her on social media, she's not your typical psychologist. Dr. Rachel is someone who helps people to find their own tools as opposed to telling them what to do. She shows them the way to find it within themselves. And it's such a breath of fresh air in these times where the pressures and challenges of fitting in and being successful overwhelm us within our society. So today's going to be a great conversation. Dr. Rachel, thank you so much for joining the Crown podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here speaking with you today and with everybody else. So thank you for having me.
I think a great place to start is where I was just leading from. There are a lot of pressures. We've been through a lot in the last few years and even in the past decade, and the world has changed. How we consume information has changed. The pressures for young people have changed. The pressures for older people have changed. The pressures for men have changed. The pressures for women have changed, and gender and sexuality. There's a lot going on all at the same time, and because we are also connected to it, all of these traumas and wars and different things, we we're almost desensitized to how much we are absorbing. And so an easy way for us to navigate through that pool of stress is to overwork ourselves, to be productive, to outwork everybody, to get to the top of the ladder. And one of the things that have been coming up, and in a way it's become quite of a buzzword, is the word burnout. And a lot of people are working themselves into the ground and becoming very, very unwell because of it. And so I just want to start off here, in your experience dealing with your clients and the many, many people who follow you in your works. How prevalent do you think burnout is? And what are some of the things to look out for? And what are some of the negative impacts of a life that is ingrained in burnout?
Yeah. So, there's so much going on, right? And there's so many pressures. And of course, I live in New York City and there's sirens in the background also. But there's so many pressures. And you said it exactly. The pressures of the world and the messages that we hear, we internalize. And for some people, that just means working harder, right? Like working harder could be a coping mechanism, right? It could be a distraction from what's really going on inside somebody or in their outside world. But unfortunately, what that can lead to is burnout. And I love talking to clients about ways to prevent burnout because either we're already there or we're on the way there, unfortunately, for most of us. Burnout's very prevalent. And I think since the pandemic has become even more prevalent just because of all of the added stressors that we all have in the world with everything going on. So I think a really good place to start would be to define what burnout is, first of all, because there is a difference between stress and burnout. The easy way to say it, but then I'll give the definition. The easy way to say it is that burnout is emotional exhaustion to the point that just taking like a day off isn't going to cure, right? So like stress, we can manage, we can do coping mechanisms. Maybe a day off gives us the relief that we need. But burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress coupled with inadequate resources to cope. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. If we don't have the proper resources to cope with those daily stressors and it continues and continues and continues, it leads to burnout and it feels exhausting, right? So the initial signs of burnout are like poor performance. We start not functioning as well as we used to. Maybe we start forgetting things. We like kind of make these careless mistakes. Also, physical and mental exhaustion. So, physically feeling that. Sleep difficulties. We know sleep, or rather, we know that stress and so much impacts our sleep, but keeping that in mind as well, that sleep difficulties could be an initial sign, as well as physical symptoms like headache or even GI issues, stomach issues, and changes in eating habits and appetite changes. So I know you had mentioned before when you were describing me and my bio that I like to focus on the mind body connection. And burnout is something that we really have to keep in mind, that we always need to be listening to our body. Our bodies are constantly telling us things. But because we live in that society of go, 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 we have to be so busy, we actually ignore signs. And if we just take a moment to sit and listen and tune in, we are going to realize that we have stress and tension that we are carrying with us that we don't realize. So many people miss these initial signs of burnout because they're just like, oh, of course I'm tired. Everybody's tired. Well, of course I made this mistake because I'm so busy. But there's actually more to it. And we have to take that moment to actually tune in and not to ignore these signs and symptoms. We can actually catch things if we tune inward. At the first sign that we feel something, we can then take a moment and think, okay, what's going on? Like, why am I not sleeping? Why is my appetite different? Why am I feeling this way? There's always a why. And it doesn't need to be just because, right? Like, I'm tired because everybody's tired. That's not really a solid answer. And we can't find a solution if we don't know what the why is. We don't know what to change.
So, and I want to stick on the mind body part because we've gone through a generation of consume information. And if we can understand it, then we should be able to fix it. However, if some of these stresses and other symptoms are trapped in the body or in another place, but we're trying to use the mind to fix it, there can be a bit of a disconnect there. And I just wonder, what can we do to kind of be more present and aware to see the signs before they get too bad? More prevention better than cure.
Well, and I love that you mentioned prevention because I actually consider self-care preventative care. And the tools that we use or the self-care practices actually can be the same tools that we use when we're stressed, but we're utilizing them for a different reason. So what I mean by that is if my toolbox of coping mechanisms might include, talking to somebody, talking it out, might include going on a run, might include some breathing exercises. Now, if I do those when I'm stressed, when I need them, amazing. It's going to lower everything on the physiological level and bring my stress state back down to a more relaxed state. But if I do those things on a regular basis, when I don't need them, I'm also going to be bringing my state wherever I am, say this is my baseline, a little bit lower. So now we're preventing because throughout the day, stress builds up, right? And I know everybody that's listening can't see this, but my hand is kind of going up a ladder, right? Stress builds up throughout the day. If we're able to catch it before and lower it, then maybe stress happens, we do a coping mechanism, it comes back down. But if we use these tools daily or on most days as self-care practices and preventative care, we're already lowering our stress level. So then when stress hits, it doesn't feel as heavy, right? And I think that's the key. And I'm not saying that people that are already feeling burnt out, too bad. We're not saying that at all, but there's things that we can do every day or we can start doing today. We don't have to wait to start feeling better, but it's about finding the time and creating the time for ourselves, which I know in the busy world that we live in, everybody says, I don't have time for self-care. I don't have time for this. But when we're talking about self-care, we're not talking about an hour-long massage or going to have an hour-long bubble bath. It can look like that, but self-care can also be just breathing. Just take a moment today to be fully intentional right now and take a breath in and out. It can be, being more mindful on your walk, putting your phone away and just being present while you're taking a walk. It can be moments. And that's actually the best self-care practices are the little things that we do every day or on most days. Because if we wait for the hour-long massage on Saturday or Sunday, then what's the rest of the week going to feel like, right? Then maybe you get relief for a few hours, but then stress happens again. So I think that's something that we can all do that's going to be helping us both physically and emotionally, both for the mind and body. And once again, they're connected, they're sending signals to each other all day long. So we really have to shift the way we think about self-care and look at it as preventative care and creating these moments throughout the day.
It's such an important point because I think a lot of people, when they hear the word self-care, they think, as you said, I don't have the time for that. You know, I work this job, I'm a mother or my father, I'm a husband, I'm a wife, and I've got so many responsibilities. I don't have time. And so I think this is what's so beautiful about your work is you show multifaceted areas of your life. You know, you show your beautiful children, and you show the journey, and you show your work, and you do a lot. You know, you are a very busy person and you still manage to keep self-care at the center of it. So I wanted to ask you, because people tend to assume that people who do what we do just have like rosy lives. They're just nice and easy. Um, what internal struggles and personal challenges have shaped your understanding of soul self-care and for yourself? You know, what kind of things have you been through that's kind of prompted you to avoid burnout, or have you been through burnout yourself?
Yeah, great question. And I love that you mentioned how I share different parts of my life because I do that for a reason. And that part exactly, you know, that I know it's tough to find time for ourselves. You know, I'm a mom of an infant and a 5-year-old. And I get it. Moms say to me all the time, how do you find time for yourself? And that's where like some other things can also come into play. But that's what I like to show that like, you know, like I'm a human too, you know, I'm juggling it all too. But I think, you know, there was one time in my life that I would say that I was experiencing burnout for sure. And I got out of the situation, which not everybody can, but and I know that I'm very fortunate that I could. But it was at my job before I started my private practice, so this was years ago at this point. But I absolutely was burnt out, overworked, underappreciated, you know, all of those things, and was, you know, I had the Sunday scaries. I was dreading Monday. I was dreading every day because I was just so burnt out, and I learned a lot from that. And my support system, including my husband, you know, was very supportive, and thanks to a lot of our conversations that we had, I was able to get out of that situation. But also just, you know, being alive these days can be challenging, right? It's hard. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we think about things, which is why I really focus on cognitive behavioral therapy in my practice, on my social media, because I truly believe that our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are linked. And it's how we view the world that shapes our behaviors and shapes how we feel about things. And, you know, not saying to put, you know, rose colored glasses on and being all positive, because that's also not helpful. As you know, probably from my social media, I'm anti toxic positivity. But there is, you know, there's some truth to thinking more positive and realistic. You know, the realistic piece is what's really important. I think for many of us, or for many people, our brain jumps to worst case scenario, but that's not helpful, right? So having this mental shift can be really helpful in the way that we view things. But I would say, you know, the time that I had at that job, and, you know, feeling burnt out, and also just, you know, unfortunately losing loved ones throughout the years, you know, for multiple illnesses and different things. I think as we get older, we appreciate life in a different way. And as we go through some really yucky, sucky situations, I think we also appreciate life differently. And I think all of those things, as well as hearing about the struggles of my clients, you know, kind of puts new perspective on things. And I think that's, at least for me, where, you know, I'm motivated and driven to live the best life that I can and to be as healthy as I can in terms of what's in my control. And I'll give an example of that because I ran marathons in my life. I'm a runner, not running marathons at the current time, but I'm a runner. And after I stopped, after a few marathons, and I kept running, everyone's like, "What are you training for?" And eventually I started saying, "I'm training for life." I'm not training for a race. I'm training for life. Why do I run? Well, first, it makes me feel amazing. It's a form of therapy for me, but also because it helps me be mentally and physically well in order to be prepared for whatever's thrown my way. And I, not you don't have to be a runner, but I think that same analogy, like I'm taking care of myself, although I'm very healthy right now, knock on wood. I'm taking care of myself and doing all these preventative things because I don't know what the future is going to hold. Right. And I think that's really important. And that's where that preventative care and self-care comes in. Just like what people say, you don't have to wait to be in crisis to go to therapy. Right. We don't want to wait to take a step back and take care of ourselves when we're really ill. Right. That's the cost of it. Right. You want to be doing these things now when you're capable of it, when you can, to helpfully prevent those other things from happening. Now, yes, life happens. Things are going to be out of our control. We can't predict the future. But at least for me, and this is what I like to share with others, and I do this personally, if I can do everything that I can do that's in my power to be as healthy as I can mentally and physically, at least then I know I'm doing the best I can to try to prevent those things from happening. And then life happens.
It's also very comforting. I used to have that same approach, and I tell my children, when you go into your exams, as long as you know you've done your best, then you don't leave saying, if only I did more, And this is very similar to this. And so one of the things that you do quite a lot on social media, and I think it's really beautiful because we speak a lot about stigmas and we speak a lot about the way things are or have been. But I notice you don't do that much. Instead, it's almost like you're trying to create the opposite. And so you're normalizing it being okay to not be okay, and I see you post these wonderful images and graphics of it's okay if you struggle to get out of bed today. It's okay if you didn't complete your to-do list today. And I think that's so important because a lot of people measure their days and whether it's successful or failure by those things. And so can you just speak a bit about why you present those very real, very normal human experiences, why you present them in that way, and how does that help, in your opinion, when it comes to a person now getting ready to engage in therapy, if they come with that approach?
Yeah. So, and you just said it, it's very normal, right? And I think that's the key because if we're not sharing this, if we're not saying it's okay to struggle to get out of bed today, the person that's struggling is going to be in their own head and think they're alone. They're going to think there's something wrong with me because I can't get out of bed today. When I'm looking at social media and all of these people are already up and at the gym and doing these things and they can't, they're going to feel even more isolated than they were. But the reality is we all struggle at times, and that's okay. Of course, we don't want to struggle for too long, right? That's when we need to get help. We need to be doing things. But it is completely normal to have those days. It is completely normal to cry, to struggle getting out of bed, not finishing your to-do list. But once again, thanks to social media, there's lots of positives and negatives, of course, the social media, but there's a lot of comparison. And as humans, we compare. I'm not going to I say this to my clients all the time. I'm not going to tell you not to compare because as humans, we do. But it's what you do with that comparison. Are you going to compare and let it put you down? Are you going to compare and let it impact your daily functioning and feel horrible about yourself? Or can you compare and be inspired, right? But because we're comparing, if you're only seeing the people doing a million things, that's probably not realistic and probably not all in one day, you're going to feel like something's wrong with you. And then because our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all linked, you're going to have this negative thought. You're going to feel worse. You're probably not going to get out of bed. And then it's going to become this vicious downward cycle. So because I want to present things on my social media platform and to my community as real as possible, I want to share that this is okay. Because I know even if it's one person that sees that post that struggled to get out of bed that day is going to see that and be like, oh, wow, that's right. It actually is okay. Because in the moment when we are stressed, when we are emotional or when we are tired, it is very hard to challenge our own thoughts. It's hard to challenge them at all times, but especially then. So if somebody's already struggling and then they see that they're going to get this boost of, okay, this is okay. This is normal. As opposed to seeing a feed that is completely full of go, 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 go. And then it just makes you feel worse. So my goal on social media has, and even with my clients, is to normalize these feelings and to show life the way that it really is, which sometimes is pretty yucky, right? But we can't just assume that everything's always positive, because also that's not helpful, because that's not reality. And especially for the people that are struggling, if they're only seeing that, they're going to feel so alone, and they're not going to seek help because they think something's wrong with them, as opposed to, wow, there's actually help out there. Somebody actually understands, somebody actually cares.
And these things that you say, they are normal, and I think that's a great, it's a great word to use to describe them. Everyone goes through it. Everyone has those days. Everyone has their peaks and their valleys, and that's unfortunately the pace of life that we live at is also normal. So we have two things going on, and it's extremely fast, and it's unhealthy, and it's a lot of negative things. And so something that's even harder than challenging our mental thoughts and our thought processes is challenging the norms that are currently within society. In what ways can we, I love the word rebel against the societal pressures, and how can we start to nurture our souls in a way that cultivates a healthier way of living?
Yeah. So it's hard, right? We do need to challenge the norms. We need to challenge everything that's going on around us. And I think it starts with conversations like this, right? It's having these conversations, it's being real, it's communicating our needs, right? Speaking up, which is not always easy, but speaking up, like to set those boundaries, right? We have to speak up, we have to communicate our needs. But before we can even do that, we have to know that something's not working for us, right? And that's what we have to look inward and ask ourselves, what's working for me and what's not, and how can I change it? But because there's societal norms, societal pressures, sometimes it goes beyond just us. And we have to speak up, we have to communicate and ask for what we need or what we want. Obviously, it's how we present it. But I think, doing these things, having these conversations is the first step. And then it's communicating those needs and knowing that we're worth it. And I think that's really important, especially when it comes to like setting boundaries. We are worth it. We have to speak up. We have to set those boundaries, because what's the alternative? If we don't, we're just going to get more burnt out, right? It's not going to work. Like if it's not working, we can't keep hitting the repeat button on what's not working. So we're worth it. And we have to do that, because the alternative isn't good.
It's so nice to hear you're worth it. And I hope to our listeners today that you are worth it, and it's important to have these very nice affirmations about yourself, because a big part of the issues that we face with our mental and emotional health is the languaging. And in your conversation with Oprah, you were speaking about this, and I want to touch on, the self-compassion, and not identifying as the problem, rather seeing that you have an issue, but you are a whole human.
It's, maybe we have an issue or have a mental health problem or have a disease or have an illness, but it doesn't need to define us. And I think that's really, really important, because language matters. The words that we use when we speak to ourselves and others impact us and impacts others. And it's quite powerful. And I think people don't really think that until it impacts them personally.
Do you have any examples?
I'm thinking we're just coming off of a holiday. There's holidays coming up. So I'm going to use an example that I get a lot of with my clients when they go home for holidays. There's usually comments about like what they're eating or what they look like. Like, should you really be eating that? Oh, you gained weight, things like that. And it might come, or probably it does, usually come from a good place, right? It usually comes from a place of concern. But if we just pick that apart for a moment, should you really be eating that, right? Let's think for a moment how that makes us feel. So the should word right there puts pressure on us, right? There's this expectation that we shouldn't be doing something. So whenever there's pressure, it leads to guilt and shame, right? So right there, just using the word should makes us feel a certain way. And that's actually brings us back to CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy, how our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are linked. If we even tell ourselves, I shouldn't be eating this, we're going to feel a certain way. But those words matter. And then we internalize these messages. We're given messages all day, every day, right? Our brain is like there's messages being thrown in our brain constantly within ourselves, from others, from individuals in our lives, from social media, from media, et cetera. And we internalize everything we hear, and our brain tries to interpret all these messages in different ways. Many times it's interpreted in ways that aren't very helpful because of years of hearing certain things and believing it, right? So words matter, and the way that things are presented. We can say the exact same thing in two different ways and have a completely different reaction or a different feeling. So every word that we use, I don't want to say needs to be thought about, because that's a lot of work, but we need to be mindful, is what I say. Be mindful of the words we're using, not just when we speak to ourselves, but others. And that self-compassion part is really important, because if we are speaking kindly to ourselves, we're going to feel the difference, because once again, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. And I often say, if we can't be our own cheerleader, who can, right? Like, we are living in our bodies with our brains 24/7. And if we are constantly putting ourselves down or constantly speaking negatively towards ourselves, it is 100% going to take a toll on us, both physically and mentally. So we are living within our brain, with our body all the time. And the best thing we can do is to speak kindly. I'm not saying speak positively, because it doesn't have to always be positive. That's not realistic either, right? Just as we say, we should never hit the snooze button. Like, no, it's okay to hit the snooze button. It's also okay to not think super positively and be like, yes, you're the best. If that's helpful, if that's motivating to you, by all means, go for it. But it's also not super realistic, right? To be super positive all the time. But we can be mindful to be kinder. And it really goes a long way. Self-compassion, feeling good about ourselves, talking nicely to ourselves impacts how we feel, and then impacts everything we do. So if we just think for a moment, and if we wake up in the morning with a negative thought, it can completely change the course of the day. If I have a negative thought, maybe I'm not going to get out of bed. Maybe I'm going to feel worse. Maybe then I'm not going to eat. Maybe then I'm not going to go to the gym. And it just becomes a downward spiral. But if I wake up with a more kind thought, the day is completely different. The day just changed, right? So I think it's important that one thought can change the course of our day. Now think of what many kind thoughts could do, right? Can really change how we think, how we feel, how we act. It can change everything.
I think compassion and care, sometimes they overlap, but I think there is a distinct difference. I think when you are compassionate, I think you're more mindful. I think when you care, it's more of an action. And so now, can we speak a bit about, some of the actual things that people can do, one, to avoid burnout, and then, as you said, preventative measures that they can take. And we spoke about CBT and coping mechanisms and just different ways of viewing situations and operating within this fast-paced society. What are some things that you can recommend to people as a great starting point?
But the first thing, I think, is to accept the fact that, life can be tough sometimes, but we have to focus on what's in our control. There's always going to be things out of our control, but we have to focus on what's in our control. And if we focus on what's in our control, it means we focus on right here and now, right? So all this should have, could have, would have, past, can't control it. So why keep thinking about it, right? All the what ifs, the future thinking, can't control it, hasn't happened yet. But we can focus on right here, right now. And I always like to just even challenge people. So anybody that's listening, like, think of one thing that you can do differently today that's going to get you one step closer. And I think, great things to think about would be your coping toolbox, right? So everybody, can have a toolbox full of tools that they can turn to. And if you don't, that's a great thing to start with to build that coping toolbox. Another thing is to look at your health behaviors. Oftentimes people say, I don't know where to start. I'm like, well, let's look at what you do every day or what you do on most days that impact your health. So that includes your sleep, your nutrition, meaning what you're putting in your mouth, what your food intake looks like, your hydration, your movement, and your stress management. And ask yourself how all of those are. And all of us can do better at least one of them, if not all of them. But pick just one. Don't overwhelm yourself. Pick just one. Maybe it's sleep. I'm going to go to bed 10 minutes earlier tonight. Think small, small, small change. Those small changes make big changes. Too big of a change is overwhelming and not sustainable. But that's a really good place to start. Look inward and ask yourself, how are my health behaviors? What can I do today? It's not about waiting till Monday. It's not about waiting until after the new year. That's all BS, right? We can actually do things today that make us feel better. It's when we're waiting, it doesn't work, because when we wait, we end up coming up with these big lofty goals that you're going to wait till Monday or wait till the new year. And then it becomes very overwhelming. It's not sustainable. If it is not simple, we're not going to do it. It has to be simple. It has to be, oh, wow, I feel great, but I didn't really change that much. I don't feel like I did anything. That's when we know that it's sustainable, when it just starts being incorporated into your daily life and it's not too hard. So I think those are some things that we can start doing now, as well as setting boundaries. Like we said before, I think that's a huge one as well. We have to set boundaries, even if it's within ourselves, right? Like, I'm going to go to bed a little earlier. I'm going to turn off my social media on my phone. I'm going to say no to certain things in order to say yes to me and self-care. Those are all very important things that are very actionable, doable, realistic, and that's important.
The theme of looking inwards keeps coming up, and we mentioned at the top, and you said quite rightly that burnout is emotional. And so there's been a lot of campaigning for mental health, and maybe not so much for emotional health. In fact, we speak about languaging. People use the phrase like, oh, you're too emotional. Oh, you're quite emotional for a man. That's what they'll say to me. Or, oh, you're a woman, you're emotional, But emotions are such an important part of life, and managing these emotions and channeling them for something good, something productive, even just channeling them for healing, like grieving and mourning and processing, is so important. And so I just kind of wanted to know, do you see a shift within your work? Is emotions being given the right amount of attention? And how important is it that we continue to keep emotions in the conversation with mental health?
So I don't think we're giving it as much attention as we need to. So, for instance, toxic positivity is a great example, right? We should always be positive vibes only. But no, we're emotional beings. That's what we are. We have a wide range of emotion. And I love that you even mentioned mourning and grief and loss, because we need to go through stages of grief when we're grieving. And those stages include many different emotions, right? We shouldn't just be happy. We shouldn't just move on. We have to grieve. And we have lots of different emotions, and we need to not ignore any of them. So if that's crying, sadness, if that's anger, it's a matter of what we do with the emotions that matter, but we have emotions, and then what do we do with them? And many times, because of the mind-body connection and because of the fight or flight response that our body naturally goes in during high stress times, if we don't eventually, once again, take that moment to sit back and tune inward, it is going to absolutely build up to the point of burnout, actually, or emotional exhaustion. And I remember I have a few clients that we talk about this all the time, that when they go, it's the fight or flight response. Your body's doing what it needs to do. But then if you don't slow down eventually, then it builds up and you crash, right? And that's also what we want to avoid. But that's going to happen if you keep denying your emotion, right? One day you're going to have this big crying fest because you haven't cried about all these little things that have been happening, and that's okay, but you don't want to get it to the point where you build it up so much and then you crash. So kind of, once again, tuning inward, being mindful of what you need, listening and giving yourself what you need when you need it is so important so that doesn't happen. It's like we don't want to just wait for the weekend, once again, to like, take care of yourself. You don't want to wait to the weekend to have all that emotion either. So really, asking, what do I need? How am I really feeling? And not ignoring it is really important. And once again, the more we talk about it, the more of these conversations we have, I think, it'll only help people realize that there's some truth to this, and we have to start doing these things, or what's the alternative?
And that just really, again, illustrates that it's okay to get help. And, it's quite horrible that there's even stigma within therapy. From your perspective, and I'm sure you've heard all the reasons why someone isn't ready for therapy or why they don't think therapy is good for them, or they don't think it's good. There could be someone listening right now who has been recommended, say you should go and see a therapist, and they may have said, no, therapy isn't for me. What are we not understanding about therapy that we should be understanding?
Yeah, such a great question. And I supervise psychiatry residents at NYU also. And this conversation just came up the other day because I was giving a resident advice in terms of how to talk to their patient about continuing therapy. So they're already in therapy, but to continue. They kind of felt like their goals were met. Let's wrap up a bow. We're good to go. I'm done. And I had said, which I want to say out loud to everybody that's listening, therapy sometimes, or rather is, another tool in our toolbox. So we have it. We don't necessarily have to use it all the time. But for people that might think, oh, yeah, maybe it would be good for somebody else, but not me. If you're going through something tough or anticipating going through something tough or stressful, what I always say is it's good to have the relationship established, have a therapist, that you can go to. So then when things get really tough, you already have that person. You don't have to start the process, right? Because the process can be quite exhausting. Let's be honest. It's not easy to find a therapist. If somebody needs to go in network with their insurance or this or that, and then, finding someone that you feel comfortable with. So, starting that process when you don't necessarily need it sounds familiar, right? Like self-care and stress management can be huge, because then when you need it, you have it. Many times people wait until they're in crisis to go to therapy, and then they get discouraged because they didn't find a good fit, or they, couldn't afford it, or this or that. So therapy can be another self-care practice or another stress management tool that we have that helps us manage life. And that's how I look at it, because, it is another tool. It helps us. It's not going to be the answer. It's not going to cure, but it's a tool. And something that's so powerful about therapy, and that I think makes it so powerful, is that you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And the therapist that you're working with only knows what you're telling them. So obviously, the more honest you are, the better. But you could tell them whatever you want, and they have to believe you because they don't know anything else, right? Like, I don't know my clients' parents that they're talking about, or their friends, so it's completely unbiased. And it's 100% their time. So I like to remind people that help is available and people want to help. Therapists are in the job that they are because they want to help. And I think it can be difficult because some people think, well, I'm not, at the point that I need it, or I'm not as bad as somebody else, and I hate that label, but I said it for a reason that way. Or I don't have a diagnosable, mental illness. It's not for me. But that's not true. Therapy can help anybody just get through life, can help during stressful times, can help you just process things and understand why you function the way you do, or why you do what you do. So we don't need a problem to go to therapy. And I think that's where, things have shifted through the years, I think, in terms of that and the messaging. But I still think many people think unless you have a problem, that you don't need therapy. So after I see my clients at the end of session, I always say to them, we always say, is there anything that might be anxiety provoking or stressful or difficult for you between now and our next session, and come up with a plan for that? And oftentimes I say, although our next session is not until next week, use me as another support, right? If you're going through something difficult, I'm part of that toolbox. I'm part of that support system. And I think that's another way to think of therapy, right? It's not a friend, right? We know that, but it is another person in your corner rooting you on and being your cheerleader when you're going through tough times. And I think that's really important, like I said, because people struggle. Everybody struggles. We all have stuff going on that nobody knows about. And you don't have to hold that in. Sometimes maybe you don't want to share something with your mom or a friend because they're also struggling. But being able to share that with a therapist takes a weight off, right? Yes, we're all human and we care about other people, but when you're in a therapeutic relationship, that's our job, right? Tell me that. Let me carry that for you. And then what I often say is, and I remember this from years ago when I worked at a very difficult job, people are like, how do you go home after hearing all of these stories from your patients and not take that home with you? And I used to tell people, I use imagery. I put it in the garbage in my office and I let them take it out at the end of the day. I don't bring it home. I leave it here and it goes in the garbage. But use us, share those things with us. Let me carry that weight and let me deal with how I'm going to deal with it by leaving it there. But a lot of times it's just getting things out, right? It's using a therapist as a sounding board. It's getting that information out. You're holding it in. You have to get it off your chest or out of your head, which is why brain dumps are also really useful, a form of journaling, but can be really helpful to just get it out and hear another's perspective. And many times people don't want to share things with other people in their lives because it might impact them, or maybe it's about them. But that's the benefit of a therapist, right? I don't know these people. It doesn't impact me the way that it would impact a good friend or a mother that you're sharing something with. So, I hope for anybody listening that's been thinking about going to therapy but hasn't yet, or is afraid to, might think about it a little more and maybe make that first step today.
And I think that's a really great way to describe it. Is a tool. It's not the complete cure. It's not the full solution. It's a tool because we're all so different. We all go through stress and burnout in different ways. And so one thing for someone may be able to work 60-hour weeks and not be burned out. Someone else could have a part-time job and be overwhelmed. And so different tools for different people. But on that, there is this, sometimes there's this pressure that we look around and we see people who may be worse off than us. And we say, okay, it's not worth me reaching out for help because this person's going through so much worse. I just need to pull myself together. But they don't feel like they can pull themselves together. For some people, it could be that they've lost someone close to them. They're grieving. For someone else, they may be struggling with their mental health, emotional health. Some people may have lost a baby. Some people may have lost a job. Maybe just the pressures of the fast-paced life can have someone feeling as though they don't want to be here anymore. And I know this is something that you come across quite a lot. I know your job is to see individuals when they do, as though it's the first time you've ever heard it. And so if there's a listener right now who's in that place of feeling helpless, feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed, feeling burned out, feeling as though there's no hope, can you speak to that person now? What would you say to them?
That you matter, your mental health matters, your life matters. We care about you and that there is help available. And I would remind them that it's not helpful to compare themselves to other people in that situation. We all have struggles. And I sometimes say, and I believe it, I kind of wish we had post-it notes on our forehead telling people what we were struggling with. Because all we see is the outward appearance. And anybody maybe can put on a happy face, get dressed, and go to the office. But we don't know what they're really going through. We don't know what's going on in their home life. We don't know what's going on in their brain. What are they telling themselves, right? So I think reminding ourselves that we all struggle at times, and one person's struggle isn't any more important or any less important than somebody else's. It doesn't work that way, right? So if you're struggling, if you're even thinking about seeking help, then the answer is yes, you should. Just the thought, should I? Absolutely. Worst case scenario, you have one session, feel good about it, and you're like, all right, I got this. I don't need other help right now. But why not inquire? Why not try? Most people that seek help and try therapy do stick to therapy for a reason because they find that it's helpful and they also learn a lot about themselves. There's help available and you matter. And I think that's the most important thing that people forget when they're really struggling. They think nobody cares.
You matter. I think that's such a beautiful way to conclude today's chapter. We've spoken about burnout, we've spoken about stress, we've spoken about the difference between burnout and stress, we've spoken about different ways that we can start to cultivate new habits that can help us to navigate this fast pace of living that we all are a part of. Then we've spoken a bit about challenging the norm, and also normalizing the human emotions and experiences that we all go through. Beautifully said just there. Dr. Rachel has just given us advice to anyone who's struggling right now, things that you can do. And ultimately, the way to avoid burnout is to practice self-care because you matter. Thank you so much for everything you've shared today, your experience, your knowledge. I recommend everyone go and follow Dr. Rachel. Her feed is filled with great, useful, actionable content. There's also a lot of humor. There's a lot of beautiful images, and it's very easy to absorb and learn from. So if you are looking for more self-care tips, you will be able to find her in the description. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation and I'm so glad that we did this.
This concludes another chapter of the Crown podcast. We hope that you are edified and blessed and inspired and informed. And until next time, stay blessed and I wish you better days.